Nirasya sarva sandeham ekikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashodjitam Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payo Rasho Mudake Lato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murna Nipatyakshito Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tviche Namah Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Param Bhojo Radha Madana Mohano Kuladi Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Seva Raghunath Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puram Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhakta Maj Jai Rachido Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Tahate Gadai Shila Tahate Nahoido Murachita Jeva Nahi Bhujikeva Shunite Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Caitanya-carit Krishna Upajive Priti Janibe Raserariti Shunile Borohohit Shriyatam Shriyatam Nityam Giyatam Giyatam Mura Chintyatam Chintyatam Bhakta Caitanya-caritamrta. So by the grace of Shri Kadayuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, nourished by Sri Rup, Sri Sanatan, Sri Jiva, Sri Raghunath, the great songbird in the inexhaustible sky of Gaura-lila, Srila Krishna Das Kaviraja Gosvami. Again, today we will continue our discussion of Sri Caitanya-caritamrta. So we're in Madhya Lila, chapter 22. We're in the early section where Bhakti Tattva is being explained, and specifically the principle that Bhakti is the foremost abhideya taught in the Shastra. So from Payar 17 and 18, the comparison between Bhakti and the rest of the Shastra's abhideyas, namely Karma, Yoga and Gyan, is being discussed. So while all of these can be called abhideyas insofar as they're all practices which are enjoined in the Shastra for bearers of particular eligibility, the point or the case being made here is that Bhakti is the principal abhideya, because all other abhideyas are dependent upon it to produce the results that they produce. Bhakti can produce the same results independent of those other processes, and Bhakti can produce results that exceed those of all other abhideyas without requiring those other abhideyas to do so. So inside the section where all these points are made, then how Gyan is dependent upon Bhakti as an abhideya is being explained. That's where we're in the midst of now. And then after that, how karma is dependent upon Bhakti as an abhideya will be discussed. So in the last class, we went over principally this verse from the Brahma Stav, where it's explained that if one pursues kaivalya or sayuja mukti, experience of oneness with the non-differentiated manifestation of the Absolute, and one rejects the process of bhakti in the course of trying to achieve that, then all one will achieve is the labor that one did trying to get it. In other words, one won't get the fruit, or one won't get the goal, and one's situation will end up resembling the condition of a person who threshes chaff, which is already devoid of rice. So here we come to now verse 23 as a second citation given to support this principle from the Gita. And we had this verse earlier in chapter 20, and we discussed Sridhar Samipad, Visvanatha Cakravarti Pad, and Sri Baladeva Dibhushan Pad's commentaries on this verse. So I'm not going to go through all those commentaries again, but we'll just look at why and what specifically, or what aspect specifically of this citation is relevant to the context here, and then we'll move on. So, anything else before I start? Otherwise, I will begin.
Yeah, can you clarify what these initials ICR and ECR stand for?
Sorry, that might look a little strange. That's something I'm using as my notation. ICR is my acronym for internal cross-references, or in other words, where these verses are cited elsewhere in the Caitanya-caritamrta itself, and ECR are external cross-references to other works of the Goswamis. So.
Okay, I should have guessed from the context. Okay, thanks.
Sure. Anyway, those may end up in footnotes whenever this publication gets close to the stage of being finalized, but for now I just left them in there for my own reference. Alright, so I'll begin. Having thus cited the verse under discussion which describes how those who reject bhakti fail to attain moksha, the following statement of Bhagavan Sri Krishna, cited from Bhagavad Gita, describes how bhakti alone is the way to transcend maya, that is, the only means to attain moksha. So, Daivi hesha gunamayi mama maya duratyaya mame vaje prapadyante mayamitam tarantite. This divine maya of mine, constituted of the gunas, is certainly difficult to surmount. Still, those who take shelter in me exclusively cross beyond this maya. So, Sri Sridhar Samipad comments that the act of taking shelter exclusively in Sri Krishna, described in this verse, refers to performing worship of Sri Krishna with unwavering bhakti. So in other words, the verse is saying that you can only transcend maya by bhakti. So the reason this is being cited is to show that you can't cross it if you reject bhakti. So thus, the verse indicates that only those who follow the path of bhakti can cross beyond maya, that is, attain moksha, implying that those who follow the path of gyan devoid of bhakti cannot attain moksha, and that those who follow the path of bhakti can attain moksha even without following the path of gyan. So, that should be quite clear. This is the purpose of the citation in the context. Krishna nitya das jiv taha buli gelo se doshe maya tar galaya bandilo. The Jiva, an eternal servant of Krishna, has forgotten this. As a consequence of that deficiency, Maya has bound his neck. So, this is a classic out here in the West Bengal villages. You can hear the Vaishnavas touting this one on the mics throughout the villages for years and years on end. This is one of the many pyres in the Caitanya-caritamrta which comes off quite cutting when it's explained in lectures. So I can confess to have hammered it on a time or two myself. But let's look at the subtlety of what's being said, not just use it for leverage to scare people. So, it was explained in verse 108 of chapter 20 that the essential nature of the Jiva is to be an eternal servant of Krishna. In this famous statement, Jiva Swarup Hoy Krishna Nitya Das. And it was explained in verses 12 to 14 of this chapter that jivas who are beginninglessly bound in samsara are in that condition because they are beginninglessly oblivious of Krishna. In the pyar under discussion, the additional point is made that such jivas are not only beginninglessly oblivious of Krishna, but also beginninglessly oblivious of their own essential nature of being his servants. Since, in the absence of awareness of Krishna, they have no awareness of their inherent status as his servants either. In response to this beginningless obliviousness, Maya keeps such jivas in bondage. See the commentaries on the aforesaid pyars for further discussion. So we've already gone through those things. Specifically here what's relevant is a comment made in the Krama Sandarbha of Jiva Gosvami, where he explains that Maya is not the cause as such of the jiva being unaware or beginninglessly oblivious of Krishna. But Maya acts upon the jiva because of the presence of that beginningless obliviousness. So oftentimes the opposite is thought, that because of the influence of Maya, the jiva is in a state of non-awareness of Krishna. But more precisely, jivas beginninglessly, which again, as for all who've heard, Babaji Maharaj's elaborate and repeated and meticulous explanation of what the principle of anadi means throughout Shastric discourse, this causeless, beginningless state doesn't have, quote, an explanation, or it just simply is taken as a given in the theological system. So there's this absence of awareness, and in response to it, which again, the response itself also being beginningless, Maya acts so as to perpetuate the jiva's lack of awareness of Krishna and itself. And similarly, when the jiva is aware of Krishna, that very same Maya, in the very same manner, supports and nourishes that jiva's awareness of Krishna. This is the point made in the Krama Sandarbha that we discussed earlier in a previous class. So that's why, say doshe Maya tar galai bandilo. This is where, out in the villages where the hammering goes on, this detail is seldom made, that it's not that Maya is the cause of that absence of awareness, but rather in response to it, Maya performs this act. So, what's also interesting is that, which something we discussed before, but this principle is mainly grounded on the verse in the Bhagavatam, Bhayam dvitiya biniveshata syat, ishad apetasya viparyayo smriti. And what's interesting is that Jiva Gosvami bases his explanation of that verse in the Sandarbhas, in the Krama Sandarbha, on Sridhara Swami's tika on the verse. But the way that he cites Sridhara Swami's tika differs from the editions of Sridhara Swami's tika that you can find everywhere else in the name of Sridhara Swami, and where it just differs by one word, and that one word changes the meaning as to the jiva being unaware of Krishna or unaware of itself. So ultimately it doesn't make a difference, because if you're unaware of Krishna, you couldn't be aware of yourself, because the nature of the self is to serve Krishna. So if you're unaware of Krishna, you're not aware of your own nature, since your own nature is inherently integrated with the role of being a servant of Krishna, as per the relationship between the Angshi and the Angsha, which we discussed at length in chapter 20. I won't go back into those details again. So anyway, it's the reason I just bring that up is that from this pyar and from the pyars mentioned earlier, we can arrive at both of those different possible statements of Sridhar Swami, whether the word is there or not there in the original tika or not. In either case, in the Caritamrta, we have evidence for the same concept, or both of the concepts being stated in relation to the jiva. So if anyone else is hung up on these kind of variant differences between tikas and was wondering about that, then this is something you might find interesting. In any case, there's no doubt that Kaviraja Gosvami has extremely meticulously gone through the works of Jiva, the works of Sridhara, and presented this Caitanya-caritamrta, milking out some very, very fine points when one has the frame of reference to appreciate them by seeing the groundwork from which he's writing. Okay, anyway, not to elaborate excessively on this, the main point is simple. The main point is simply that the Jiva, by nature, is a servant of Krishna, but is unaware of that, and as such is bound by Maya, and under the influence of Maya is acting on the basis of a false notion of self and pursuits that are only in the interest of that false self, not its actual self. So these are all points we've already discussed. So this and the following payar are an explanation of the import of the aforecited verse from Srimad Bhagavad Gita. So this is also an important point to catch, is why now is he coming with this? Or in other words, he just quoted this famous verse of the Gita, and then it almost looks like he's going off in another direction and talking about something else. But he's not actually. He's actually drawing out some subtle sense of what this Gita verse means. So how so? This payar explains the jiva's entanglement in Maya as referred to in the first line of the verse. So when the previous verse said, this divine Maya of mine is difficult to surmount, then what's a situation that's difficult to surmount? How about being tied up around the neck with a rope? That's a tough spot. So this duratyaya, he's comparing that to being tied up by the neck. And how so? Or, Maya with these gunas, and again, the word guna, as we discussed in the commentaries and when we went through this previously, has the sense of guna meaning sattva, raja, tama, but it also has the sense of rope. The word guna can mean a thread or a string. So he's drawing out a sense of this rope around the neck to this idea of this Maya made of gunas that's difficult to escape. So as this Maya made of these gunas is difficult to escape, so too is the situation of being bound up with a rope around your neck. And so what does that metaphor refer to? It refers to that state of being totally aware of who oneself is. Just as, if people have seen movies or dramas about someone with amnesia or someone who, has no awareness of self, then they can walk around doing nothing but self-destructive behavior with no awareness that they're even doing it. So someone could, if you just remove their memory of who they are, they could go out and utterly embarrass themselves and do things that they would never do. And, they would do it all the while willingly and adamantly. But so soon as their memory returned, they would be aghast with embarrassment. So something like that, when the awareness of self is completely suppressed, then you have all these jivas walking around like they're in a dream world, walking around like they're not themselves, doing all these things that are completely contrary to the purpose of their own existence. So this is what he wants to draw out by this idea of why it's so hard to escape. In other words, it's not hard to escape like a wall that's hard to climb over. It's hard to escape because you're trapped in something that you don't even know you're trapped in, and you're just proactively perpetuating your own entanglement intentionally. So there you get the sense of the first half. So now, the following payar explains what is entailed in taking shelter in Krishna and crossing beyond Maya as spoken of in the second line of the verse. So the second line of the Gita verse says, those who take shelter in me cross beyond Maya. So now he gives a gist rendering or an image. What does that look like? So he says the following in verse 25. Tate Krishna bhaje kore guru sevan Mayajal Chute Pai Krishna Racharan. Therein, a jiva worships Krishna and it engages in service to the Guru. Then he gets free from Maya's net and attains Krishna's feet. So, quote, therein refers to the condition of the aforementioned beginninglessly oblivious jivas of being bound in Maya. If a jiva in this condition worships Krishna and engages in service to the Guru, then the jiva gets free from Maya's net and attains Krishna's feet. Although service to the Guru is an integral part of worship of Krishna, it is mentioned as a separate activity in this payar to stress its importance. So this is a point made by Radha Govindanath, which I felt was worth adding here, because as we'll see later in the chapter, service to the Guru, taking shelter in the Guru, are considered the first of and fundamental practices of the path of bhakti, as given in these 64 practices by Rupa Gosvami, which will be discussed later in this chapter. So if these things are already entailed in worshipping Krishna, then to speak of them as two separate items could create a different impression. So we can say, why does he go ahead to make this separate step or make this separate mention of it? It's because of its importance, because he's talking about a jiva going from ground zero or going from a state of complete obliviousness to attaining Krishna. So in that process, the portion of taking shelter in the Guru, serving the Guru, is so pivotal, so significant that it's worthy of special mention. This is how we can understand why the separate statement is made. So we'll get to discussion of what that specifically entails later in the chapter. So now a little road mapping. Payars 17 and 18 of this chapter stated that the Shastra's principle abhideya is Krishna Bhakti, and that both Gyan and Karma are dependent upon Bhakti to bestow their respective results. Verses 19 to 25 have been stated to affirm that Jnana without Bhakti cannot bestow moksha. So that's where we're up to now. This whole discussion, up to where we just arrived now, was all stated to demonstrate how Bhakti can give you moksha without Gyan, and Gyan cannot give you moksha without Bhakti. In the following payar, and the pair of verses from Srimad Bhagavatam cited thereafter in support of it, Karma's dependence upon Bhakti is demonstrated. So now we come to the next step in the thought progression, because as was given in 17 and 18, his purpose is to show that Bhakti is the principle of Abhideya, and that Karma and Gyan are dependent on it. So now he's done Gyan, now he comes to dealing with Karma. So he states the following. Charivanashrami jadi Krishna nahi bhaje, swakarma korite se rourava parimoje. Sorry, this just reminds me of village lecturing, because these statements get, this one also gets used with a lot of leverage. If a member of the four varnas and ashramas does not worship Krishna while performing one's karma, one falls and remains submerged in Raurava. In other words, if you don't worship Krishna, you go to hell. This is how this statement can get, turned into a weapon, so to speak, or used to motivate people by fear, which is not the primary purpose of it, but nevertheless is not the meaning of it, and is rather this is rather a poignant or a pointed rendering of it, which is justified in, or is actually grounded in the way that Jiva Gosvami and others have commented on the Bhagavatam verses that we'll get to in a second. So here the word karma refers to the duties of one's varna and ashram. And in case you're wondering what type of hell this is among the 20 that are found in the Bhagavatam, then we hear that, I'll just explain it. So Raurava it basically means the place of the Rurus. And there's this entity called a Ruru, which is said to be something like a swamp deer, but with very sharp antlers, which also has a nature which is more cruel, or more, ferocious than even a snake. So, so imagine like a snake, except it's giant like a deer, and it has like fangs like a wolf. So this is a place where all the people that you may have caused harm to in your life assume the form of these rurus and then perpetually attack you until they've exacted enough suffering out of you to warrant sufficient punishment for the harm that you caused them. This is said to be the state that that persons find themselves in this place called Raurava. So one can refer to the 5th canto for description of this and other hellish conditions that are met with by jivas whose karma is said to warrant such. So in the commentaries on the Bhagavatam, it simply says Naraka Pat, or that one can fall into Naraka. So why exactly among the categories of Naraka the word Raurava was chosen here, that I don't find precise reference for. Perhaps it was something, perhaps it was one of the domains of Naraka well known within the cultural context, but I can't say for certain. In any case, the main verse from the Bhagavatam, which is given in this regard, which shows the dependence of karma upon bhakti, is as follows. Mukha bahuru padebhya purushasashramai saha chatvaro Jagire varna guner viprada pritak Yayisham purusham sakshar atma prabham ishvaram Nabhajatya vajananti stanad brashta patanyadha. The 4 separate varnas, brahmana and so forth, are born from the face, arms, thighs and feet of the purush by means of the gunas, along with the 4 ashramas. Those persons among these varnas and ashramas who do not worship and thus disrespect the Purush, himself, the source of the self, Ishvara, become deviated from their position and fall down. Okay, so there are some significant points in the commentaries on this verse. So we'll look at these. We'll start with Sridhar Samipad, and I'm just going to read the translation. One can refer to the footnote for the Sanskrit text. To state that they, that is, those who do not worship Sri Bhagavan, undergo distress, or alternately go to Naraka, because of an offense to a guru as a result of their disrespect to Bhagavan, who is their own progenitor and consequently their guru. He describes the generation of the varnas and ashramas directly from Bhagavan. So, guru aparad, or to make offense to the guru, is, classically understood to be a troublesome type of offense. So the verse describes Bhagavan in such a way that any person in the society can understand that one has a relationship with Bhagavan such that Bhagavan is one's guru. Now again, here guru doesn't necessarily specifically mean spiritual preceptor in this context, but it means elder more generally, a person who's worthy and ought to be shown reverence. So people can understand that the parents are fit and worthy to be revered. So if it can be shown that Bhagavan is also just like one's own parent, or just like one's own elder or guru, then one can understand that one is duty bound to show respect to Bhagavan. So to demonstrate how it is that Bhagavan is just like, or is an elder to all human beings, then this line of thought is given that the varnas, the ashramas, are born from Bhagavan's body. Because as a vivid image, so to speak, people can understand the idea that my parents are those persons from whom I am born. So if they have a sense of identification that I'm a brahmana, or I'm a kshatriya, or I'm a brahmachari, or what have you, and they understand that those roles in society are born directly from Bhagavan, then they can infer, or they can establish this sense of identity that a part of who I am has been directly brought about by Bhagavan himself. And therefore I have this relationship by virtue of my identity that I strongly identify with, wherein Bhagavan is an elder to me, he is a provider, he is a progenitor to me. So then I'm duty bound to respect him or to honor him, just as I am other elders or my parents.
Recording in progress.
So this is the line of thought that is developed in the verse. So moving on, by means of the gunas means the Brahmana Varna was generated by means of sattva, the Kshatriya Varna was by means of sattva and rajas, the Vaishya Varna by means of rajas and tamas, and the Shudra Varna by means of tamas. Among these varnas and ashramas, those who, not having understood, do not worship, and also those who, even having understood, disrespect the Purush, he because of whom one's own origination occurs, become deviated from their position, that is, from their varna and... Oh, thank you, I'm muted. Oh dear. Sorry, I think my line dropped for a sec. I'm just reading along here. So, we made the point that Bhagavan is the progenitor and that from him come the varnas, and the varnas are manifest by means of the gunas. So it's given here, brahmanas from sattva, kshatriyas from sattvas and rajas, vaishyas from rajas and tamas, shudras from tamas. So among these varnas and ashramas, those who not having understood do not worship, and also those who, even having understood, disrespect the Purush, he because of whom one's own origination occurs, become deviated from their position, that is, from their varna and ashrama. So, some persons who do not understand the Purushas, that is, Sri Bhagavan's rightful worthiness of compulsory worship, and thus do not worship him, and others, even after having understood his rightful worthiness of compulsory worship, disrespect him by neglecting to worship him. Both become degraded as a result. When non-worship of him occurs, ingratitude also does. So if he is the provider of your livelihood, if he's the provider of things that are integral to your life, your identity, your well-being, your sustenance, and you don't show any respect to that, you don't show any gratitude to that, then that's an expression of ingratitude. So to show ingratitude to someone who has provided for you, who has nourished you, who has supported you, this is a type of disrespect. This is a type of offense. So this is Sridhar Swami is drawing out this as the logic as to why people should have this idea that worship of Bhagavan is not just optional or not just nice, but rather compulsory for every living being. If he who is the source and the sustenance of one's very existence, to go on existing, ignoring him or not recognizing his role in that sustained existence that one has, is both a state of ignorance as well as a state of disrespect. So this is what's meant to be conveyed here. So thus he says Ishvara, or thus he specifies that the Purush from whom the Varnas and Ashramas are manifested is Ishvara. That is he whose capability is the basis of the totality of existence, and thus who is invariably worthy of offerings of gratitude from all living beings. So again, the point here is to instantiate why bhakti is compulsory. So in the path of karma, people feel that following the duties of their varna and their ashrama is the most important thing, and by doing that they will achieve the purusharthas, by doing that their life will be successful. They don't need to engage in bhakti in addition to that, or apart from that. Just doing that is plenty. Sometimes, in modern India, sometimes people say, work is my worship, Meaning, my karma is my dharma. My performance of my duties of my varna and ashram, this is my worship of Bhagavan. And there are statements in the Shastra which do speak to that effect, as we saw in the Ramananda Sangvad. The discussion begins with this verse, Varna Shrama Charavata, where it is saying that there's no other way to please Bhagavan than following your varna and ashram dharma. In other words, following your varna and ashram dharma is a way of pleasing Bhagavan, or it is a way of worshipping Bhagavan. So this is one of the main, you could say, strong features of Srimad Bhagavatam as a Shastra within the broader canon of, quote, Hindu scriptures, that the Bhagavatam comes out strong on this point, saying, no, following your varna and ashram dharma is fine, it's honorable, it's valuable, it's not to be deprecated, it's not to be, faulted. But in addition to that, or fundamental to that, there ought to also be recognition of Bhagavan specifically, and the intent or awareness of worshipping Bhagavan specifically, with a sense of identity that is not limited to one's role in the varnashram grid, if you will, but rather grounded in a spiritual conception of self. This is one of the things that makes the Bhagavatam a very unique text within the broader Hindu canon. And this verse is one of the points, or one of the aspects of Bhagavatam where this point is drawn out or put into vivid contrast. So we'll get to a little bit more about that in a second. One point that Jiva Gosvami adds to Sridhar Swami's comment is that, and this is perhaps relevant to those who read these things very literally, that, quote, from the face, arms, thighs, and feet is an elliptical reference, or upalakshana, with respect to the ashramas, since it is later stated by Sri Bhagavan that, quote, the grihastha ashram appeared from my loins, brahmacharya from my heart, and vanaprastha from my chest. Sannyas was situated in my head. So in other words, you might read this verse, and it's saying, from the arms, the face, the thighs, and the feet came the varnas along with the ashramas. So that would imply that, or you could interpret it that then the varnas and the ashramas came from those 4 body parts of the Purush. So just in case you were thinking like that, Jiva Goswami wants you to know that actually that only applies to the varnas, and the ashramas actually came from other body parts of the Purush. So make sure you have your anatomy well in order when it comes to where the ashramas came about. So this is Jiva Goswami's point. And second, Jiva also accepts the interpretation of the phrase, do not worship and thus disrespect, given by Sridhar Swami, but offers an additional second interpretation to complement it. Quote, do not worship and thus disregard is the meaning. That is, not only showing disrespect, but even neglecting to make offerings of worship is also a form of disrespect of the Purush. Alternately, some, having heard, do not worship. But if some, having heard, do not worship, they verily disrespect him, is the meaning. So what Jiva Goswami is showing is that what Sridhar Swami said may be what you call some ativapti. Or in other words, if we say it's a fault to not worship him whether you know it or not, that implies that every human being who doesn't receive the necessary education and opportunity to render worship to Bhagavan is in a condition of committing offense, or in a sinful condition. So what Jiva Goswami is saying is softening the idea and saying that for persons who may have been born into circumstances where they never received this kind of education, then those persons aren't necessarily held at fault for not doing what they don't even know they're meant to be doing. But those persons who do hear, those persons who do receive that education, and then after receiving it decide to ignore it, who disregard it, those persons become degraded in particular. So this is, I think, an important point because practically speaking, it may be a bit strong to argue for the first case. But at least the way Jiva Gosvami comments, he doesn't necessarily say that the first interpretation is wrong, but he just adds this second interpretation. And usually, when you have the second interpretation with the yadva before it, usually the commentator will favor the later interpretation. So in the first interpretation, anyone who does not worship the Purush is guilty of disrespecting the Purush. And in the second interpretation, those who have never heard about the Purush and his rightful worthiness of compulsory worship from all living beings do not disrespect him by not worshipping him. But those who have heard about his rightful worthiness of compulsory worship and disrespect him by they do disrespect him by neglecting to worship him. In either case, the gist of the reasoning presented in the verse, as per Sri Chakravarti Pad's explanation, is that Sri Bhagavan is the origin of all living beings, and thus their original father. He is thus worthy of compulsory worship, and neglecting to offer such compulsory worship is indeed a form of disrespect, that is, ingratitude. Those who commit such disrespect, what happens to them? Becoming deviated from their position, that is, from their own shelter in the form of their varna and ashram, and gradually go down and down, that is, become degraded and sink into naraka. Oh no, the line dropped again.
Recording in progress.
Sorry about that. Looks like my connection is a bit weak today. So anyway, here you get the point from this point that I'm on now. You get reference to how this statement came earlier in the Payar about how the person is said to sink into Raurava, or this strong remark is said where even by following your duty, you sink into Naraka. So this is, this can come as like a shocking remark to many persons who are deeply steeped in Brahminical culture, in observance of the stages of life. If you come along and you say to them, okay, you were a good brahmachari for many years, then you carefully followed the grihastha ashram duties for the majority of your life. Maybe in your later life you became a vanaprastha and sannyasi or not. Whatever the case may be, even by doing all of that, you still end up going to hell. You still end up sinking into a degraded condition, even after all of that. So, what the Bhagavatam is arguing for here is that, yes, if in the midst of all this observance of one's social duty and one's role in society, one doesn't have a broader integrated understanding of how that sits within the ontological reality of the samsara existing within the great manifestation of the totality of Bhagavan's existence, and how jivas fundamentally have this eternal relation with Bhagavan and are fundamentally, by being parts of this ultimate whole, have a role of servitude to that whole and to that supreme person from whom this whole is manifest, then to neglect that is to lead to a degraded future, or that will result in a lesser condition of the jiva. So what this implies then is that the whole karma marg is a training process which is meant to prepare people or bring about a social order and a psychological a state of the psyche which is conducive to the reception and practice of bhakti. Now bhakti can manifest and come along and override whatever tamasic or other influences may be there. It has the power to do so, but nevertheless, when the psyche is set up to already be purified to a certain extent of many unfavorable habits, behaviors, and so forth, this is facilitates the process. So generally speaking, as we see in the Gita as well as the Bhagavatam, the karma marg is fundamental to and considered a favorable approach towards the path of bhakti. But if someone follows all of that, all these aspects of the karma marg, but ultimately doesn't accept or intentionally rejects the path of bhakti, then this doesn't lead them to any ultimate spiritual attainment. This is the main point being made. So, I see, it looks like I'm having a connection issue again. Oh dear.
Recording in progress.
Haribol, sorry about that. Looks like my connection is not sufficient today. I apologize for the inconvenience. So, anyway, we'd come to the end of this discussion of these pair of verses in the Bhagavatam. So, essentially the point is being made that even if someone appropriately follows the karma marg, if they disregard the bhakti marg, they disrespect Bhagavan, then just following those practices of the karma marg doesn't actually lead to a existentially better future, but rather it leads to gradual degradation. This is the point that is being made in these verses. So we'll look at one more for today. So now he comes back to discussion of the Jnana Marg one more time. So having thus cited this pair of verses that show how following the path of karma, that is, observing the duties of one's varna and ashram, do not lead to weal if one neglects to engage in bhakti to Sri Bhagavan, it is next further clarified that Krishna Bhakti alone is the principal abhideya of the Shastra, because both karma and gyan are dependent on it to bestow their respective results. In the following payar, another statement is made regarding the inability of gyan not only to produce moksha without bhakti, but also its inability to produce even the primary prerequisite for moksha, namely purification of the psyche, chitta shuddhi, without bhakti. So this is, because it may seem strange if he spoke about why Gyan is not an independent abhideya or the supreme abhideya, then he speaks about how karma is not the principal abhideya, and now he's coming back to talk about the Gyani. You might be like, why is he going out of order like this? It almost seems redundant. So rather, he's going like a level of further critique. In other words, first he's showing that the path of Gyan won't get you to moksha without bhakti. Then he's saying, even if you follow the path of karma, you won't achieve an auspicious future if you neglect the path of bhakti. And now he's saying that, and if you try to follow the path of Gyan, neglecting the path of bhakti, you won't even get what you could have gotten just by remaining a karmi. In other words, the path of karma is typically considered what prepares one to take up either the path of Gyan or the path of bhakti. Because as it's given in the Gita, it's only Gyan or bhakti that can lead to an eternal attainment or an eternal transcendental or paramartik result. So now he's saying, not only will you not get the result, but even the intermediary purification or the preliminary aspects of the path that are required to ultimately achieve that higher end result, you won't even get the intermediate level of preparation or advancement from the path of Gyan if you neglect the path of bhakti. So he's going to a level of further critique by saying the following. A Gyani thinks, I have attained the state of a Jivan Mukta. In reality, however, the intellect is not purified without Krishna Bhakti. So let's look at this for a second here. Sri Jiva Gosvami summarizes the state of Jivan Mukti, that is the state of being liberated while living, as a jiva existing within the gross and subtle bodies without absorption in those bodies. So first we're going to look at what does this term Jivan Mukta mean, because it's important to understand what specifically it refers to in order to grasp what's being discussed here. So the simplest definition we get, this is from his commentary on the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, is that someone is in the gross body, in the subtle body, but not absorbed in them. Or in other words, they're not identified with them, their awareness is not influenced in an untoward manner by the residual presence of them. In other words, one is fully fixed and aware of one's spiritual object while still embodied in these two layers, so to speak. Most simply put, this is what is called Jivan Mukti. So then, in the Sandarbhas, he gives some examples from Bhagavatam to demonstrate this idea, or to show where the Bhagavatam speaks of this state of what's called Jivan Mukti. So, quote, that vision wherein the gross and subtle bodies are negated, i.e. understood to not be the self, through full knowledge of the self, such that they are recognized to have been superimposed upon the self by ignorance, is vision, or darshan, that is, direct experience of Brahman. So Jiva Gosvami comments on this as follows. Direct perception of Brahman, acquired through perception of a qualified sameness in nature, or tadatmya, an acquired non-ontological oneness with Brahman, by means of a direct perception, verily while living, of the essential nature of the jiva, that makes known the falsity of any relation with the effects of maya fabricated out of ignorance, is a specific type of Jivan Mukti. Sri Jivapad specifies here that the aforementioned state of, quote, a special type of Jivan Mukti, because it is a type of Jivan Mukti pursued by Gyanis. So he gives another category or notion of Jivan Mukti related to bhaktas. So that's not specifically relevant to this discussion, because as we look at this payar, this is a statement of a Gyani thinks, I'm a Jivan Mukta. So what we're talking about is the type of Jivan Mukti that a Gyani thinks they've attained. Darn, there goes the line again.
Recording in progress.
Sorry, friends. Okay, let's see if we can get through this. We've just got a few more minutes. So, what's interesting is there's a well-known Advaita Vedanta text called the Vedanta Sar, and there the text presents so many views of their process, and then culminates in discussion of the idea of reaching the state of Jivan Mukti. So near the very end of the text, you get the following definition of Jivan Mukti. And interestingly, the way Jiva Gosvami has defined the Gyani's Jivan Mukti in the Sandarbhas is quite parallel with the way this Advaita Vedantic text defines it as follows. Quote, a Jivan Mukta is known as one who is fixed in Brahman, and free from all bondage on account of ignorance and its effects, in the form of accumulated karma, doubt, misapprehension, and so on, being negated as a result of direct perception of one's own essential nature, that is, undivided Brahman.
Recording in progress.
Oh man, this thing keeps dropping. By means of the negation of ignorance of Brahman, through knowledge of one's own essential nature, that is, undivided Brahman. So again, this is a definition given in the Advaita viewpoint. So in the Advaita viewpoint, the self is nothing but Brahman. So when one realizes or negates all that is not the self, one has perception of one's own self as Brahman. So this is what these followers of the path of Gyan think they've attained. They study their process, they come to this understanding of a theory about what are the adjuncts of Maya, what is the gross body, what is the subtle body, etc. And as an outcome of that knowledge, they feel that they have come to that state of awareness in which they are Brahman, and they're no longer absorbed in or identified with the gross or subtle body. So we have a definition from a Vedantic text, and we have Jiva Goswami's definition, which essentially match. We have a Praman from Bhagavatam, and in gist, we can see that all these point to the same idea of what it is that a Jnani thinks they reach by what is called Jivan Mukti. So in contrast to that, on the path of Bhakti, Jivan Mukti is defined differently. So we have a verse given elsewhere in the Sindhu, quote, "One who has the desire for servitude to Hari, in deed, mind, and speech, even in all circumstances, is called a Jivan Mukta." So in the case of a Bhakta Jivan Mukta, there is also no absorption in the gross or subtle bodies, but this non-absorption is brought about just by knowledge of Brahman.
Recording in progress.
Is not brought about just by knowledge of Brahman, but rather by knowledge of Bhagavan and desire for his service. So how it is that Jnanis falsely think they have attained the former state of Jivan Mukti, that is, the state of perceiving a qualified sameness in nature of the self with Brahman, wherein ignorance and the effects of Maya are negated, yet in reality have not attained this state, is explained in the following citation from Srimad Bhagavatam, and elucidated in the commentaries as follows. So, we'll conclude here for today, and in the next class we'll look at this verse in the Bhagavatam, which is a very significant verse in this regard, and we'll look at some elaborate commentary on this verse, because I think it's worth it. It brings out a lot of subtlety. Chakravarti Pad ultimately breaks it out into 4 different potential categories and outcomes, and brings out essentially what is the difference between the 2 types of Jivan Mukti, and why it's impossible for even a Jnani to achieve the aforementioned type of Jivan Mukti found among Jnanis if they neglect the path of Bhakti. And in doing so, it's shown that if a Jiva can't actually achieve Jivan Mukti by following the path of Jnana alone, then that implies that the psyche cannot actually be purified by the path of Jnana alone, which means that that Bhakti is required even to affect the process of Chitta Shuddhi, which means then that without taking up the path of Bhakti, one can't even achieve what one could otherwise achieve by following the path of karma. So this is the scope of the critique, if you will, that's being offered here. So I apologize for the poor connectivity today. I'm sure it was not possible to go through all the points I was making, but you have the text at least, so I think mainly you can gather what we're trying to discuss from that. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or otherwise, please feel free to share now. Yes, I see a hand.
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay, sounds good. So, yeah, I think there's a slight delay maybe. So, let me see. Okay, yeah, so I was curious, the type of offense that we discussed where one is aware of Bhagavan's, of the obligation to worship Bhagavan, but neglects to do so or decides not to do so for some reason. That got me thinking about some of the things I was reading on some of the articles and transcripts on the Jiva Institute's website about the distinction between sin, kind of like prakriti sin, as compared with offenses in bhakti. And I was wondering, is the kind of offense we discussed today, is it more like a prakritic sin, or is it more like an offense in bhakti? Or maybe another category?
So what was the adjective you're using for sin there?
Oh, prakritic, like sin,
okay.
like bad action, but unrelated to bhakti.
Yeah, so in this context, because it's speaking specifically of disregard for Bhagavan, it would be, in the category of aparad, or it would be in the category of what relates to the relation between Bhagavan and the jiva.
That makes sense. So the discussion of the Rurus and the Rauravas, I have to confess, I got a bit scared because the first couple of years that I was, after I'd heard about Krishna Bhakti, like in 2018 and 2019, I'm afraid I did commit some offenses in Krishna Bhakti. I don't know if I want to go into all of them right now, but I got a little bit scared. So I was wondering if I live for like another 20 years at least, and I get in some solid, unoffensive practice of bhakti in the next 20 years, can that counteract offenses in bhakti, or including not worshipping Bhagavan and other offenses too? Or like, what's the best way to counteract offenses in bhakti that have already been committed?
Well, the beauty of the path of bhakti is that bhakti itself is the greatest atonement that one can ever perform. This is discussed in the Bhagavatam and other derivative works, that if one, in the process of following the path of bhakti, commits some wrong, then the best way that one can rectify that is simply continuing to follow the path of bhakti. There isn't any external or derivative other process that needs to be added to it or augmented it the way you find in the karma marg. So, depending on the context, there's the principle if a Vaishnava is offended, one should seek forgiveness from the Vaishnava. Things like this are there, depending on the specific case. But in general, by following the path of bhakti, by engaging in the worship of the name and the other purifying processes.
Recording in progress.
Sorry about that.
What's the connection?
Yeah, I'll be quick here and just say, hopefully you can hear me, and just say that bhakti itself is the greatest form of atonement. So bhakti itself will rectify all offenses or shortcomings that may have occurred in the process of one performing it. And other than in special cases, such as if one has offended a particular Vaishnava, one should seek forgiveness from that particular Vaishnava. Other than those type of specific cases, just continuing to sincerely follow the path of bhakti is itself the most purifying and atoning act that one could ever do.
Thank you. Yes, the last bit there was quite clear, so I got it. Thank you.
Okay, great. And maybe I'll just add as a footnote to that in the process of bhakti that we're taught to be motivated for practicing it by fear of suffering from not doing it or feeling as though trapped, oh no, I have to do this because if I don't, I'm committing offense. This also will not be the ideal mentality by which it is performed. And so we can say that such a beautiful, great effort has been made, in particular by the acaryas of our sampradaya and other acaryas, to show the beauty of the path of bhakti, to show the beauty of Bhagavan, the beauty of his name, all of these things, such that one can practice these things not merely as an act of, evading a cause of fear and suffering, but rather as something that can become an act of inspiration and an act of gratitude and recognition and ultimately an act of love. So anyway, the connection keeps dropping. I'll leave it at that for today. Vaishnavebhyo namo namah.